So welcome to this summer school lunchtime lecture. My name is Claire Kelly. I'm one of the conveners of the summer school program, and I'd like to welcome you here this afternoon. I'd also at this stage like to ask you to turn off your cell phones, just to remind you. Thank you. It is also my role here this afternoon to introduce you to our speaker, Dr. Zwelethu Jolobe. Zweli is a regular contributor to summer school, and I'm very, very pleased that he's back this year. And let me tell you a little bit about him. He is best known for providing an analytical voice on the country's political happenings for the media. You might have seen him on SABC every now and again. He holds an MA in International Relations from UCT and a PhD in Political Studies, which focuses on the theory of political negotiations. He started his career as a policy researcher for the Centre for Development and Enterprise, a policy think tank in Johannesburg, before taking the academic route and specializing in the area of comparative politics. He joined the Political Studies Department here at UCT at the beginning of 2005. His fascination with the different and often complex ways in which power relations manifest in society was key to his choice of political science. And his research areas include comparative politics, international relations, African politics, political violence, revolutions, contemporary South African politics, and democratization. I don't think we can find a better person to talk to us on this subject. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Zwelethu Jolobe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me? Okay, yes, well, thanks. It's good to be here, to see you guys again, another year, and a different year. I think that this year's local elections does sort of promise to be one of the more exciting ones for reasons that I will talk about just now. But I think that what I'm going to do is that because we're at the university, I think that I'll sort of try and design my lecture in a way in which I explain to you how I do my or how I predict, and whatnot. And so my lecture will really focus on sort of 6 main themes. And the first one, I think, is that, you know, because we're looking at an election, and a local one in particular, it's important for us to get a sense of what our electoral system is. And I think that many journalists confuse the national with the local. And the local elections are quite complex, simply because how you vote in Cape Town is very different to how you vote in Laingsburg, for instance, or how you vote in Colesberg is different from how you vote in Bloemfontein. And this affects how parties think about elections. And it also affects why it is that the ruling party has an enormous amount of power in certain areas and not others. It's really as a result of the design of our system. The second thing I'll do is that I'll look at our party system. And this is important because in as much as there are about 120 parties that exist within this country, and that there are about, give or take, between elections, 7 to 8 that are in Parliament, most of them are not relevant. I don't mean this in a very sort of bad way, but that they don't dominate the space. And we don't look to them when we look at conflict or policy issues and whatnot. And so it's important to be quite clear as into why it is that I choose to look at certain parties and not others. And then once I'm sort of dealt with the conceptual stuff and whatnot, we'll look into the main issues of my class. And the first one being trying to identify what the main trends have been. And with that, I'm not going to pay attention more to, you know, who got what result in which election, but what do we look at and what do we look for in terms of how we predict, right? Number 2, I will look at this whole notion of the swing vote. I think that many people tend to think that our voting market is very saturated and that people have set voting patterns and behavior and so forth. But my experience and my view is different. I think that the potential for a different system is there. It's just that we, or most parties, if you like, don't capitalize on that. Then I will look at what the key battlefields will be, meaning what I think where the excitement is going to be and what to look for, and then we'll get into some dangerous territory and predict. And I will eat my hat if I'm wrong, but normally I think I'm pretty much on the mark. Right. Okay, but let's begin at the beginning. How does our system look like? It's important for me to do this, and I do this for my students all the time because they also conflate it, right? And yes, there's a very big difference between voting at a national and provincial level on the one hand, and also how we vote at a local level, right? Nationally, the system is simple, right? We use what is called a closed list proportional system, which basically means that divisions in an electorate, or in our one at least, are reflected proportionally in the elected body, whether it's a provincial parliament or whether it's the national parliament, right? Which basically means that if 30% of the electorate support a certain party, then roughly 30% of the seats will be won by that party, right? And the essence of this system, in comparison to others, is that all votes contribute to the result, which is different from the American system or the British system. Typically, just to put it in there, our parliament has 400 seats, and each of the 9 provincial parliaments has between 30 and 90 seats, depending on the number of people who live in that province. And that provincial and national elections are held together, and that before the elections, parties draw up a list of candidates, and we vote for the party. But we don't have any influence or impact on the order of those seats, even though we may think that the number 5 on the seat is the best person for us. By contrast, in our local system, things are different, right? And they work differently in quite important ways. And the first thing to note is that there are different categories of municipalities. And these 3 different categories all have different electoral systems, right? Which means that the city of Cape Town has a different system to Colesberg. Or within the Free State, Bloemfontein, Colesberg have very different systems. If we begin with what we term category A, which are metropolitan areas, these ones exist in the 8 biggest cities and have more than 500,000 voters. And the metro basically coordinates the delivery of services to the whole area. Right? And there are 8, namely Johannesburg, Cape Town, eThekwini, which is Durban, Tshwane, which is Pretoria, Nelson Mandela Bay, which is Port Elizabeth, Mangaung, which is Bloemfontein, and Ekurhuleni, which is the East Rand. Sorry, Ekurhuleni. Oh, Buffalo City, sorry. That's East London, yes, sorry. And all of these are broken into different wards. And how you vote here is that in each council, 50% of the councillors are elected through a proportional ballot, where voters vote for a party, right? So you get 2 ballots, and in the first ballot, you vote for your party. The other 50% are directly elected as ward councillors through a first-past-the-post ballot, right? A winner takes all ballot by the residents of each ward. Now, by contrast, category B are pretty much small towns, right, that are not metros. And these make up the majority of local councils in the country, something like 231 of them. And like metro councils, they are also broken up into different wards. And that voters in these wards will also vote for 50% of councillors who are elected through a proportional ballot, and they will also vote for an additional 50% as ward councillors. However, we also have a third category of councils that are related to local councils, which are called district councils or district management councils, which are places that are lowly populated. And in these councils, local voters vote for members of these councils. Right? There are 47 district councils, which are basically made up of a number of local municipal areas, normally between 5 and 6. And a council is made up of two types of councillors. The first one are those who are elected councillors, who are elected by local council voters to represent their interests in district councils. Stop me if you're lost. It can be confusing, right? Which means that if you reside in a local municipality, you cast 3 votes. One is for your proportional candidate for your local council. The second is for your ward councillor. And the third is through your party, a councillor for the district council. Right? And then the remainder of the councillors, 60% of them, are councillors who are sent as delegates by their council to represent their interest on the district council. It's an elaborate system, which means that at the core of any election is to make sure that your party members sit on every council. Right? Just to simplify it, basically, summarize, basically, in terms of who votes for what, Metro Council votes, which is us. I assume we're all from Cape Town. Our vote is simple, right? You vote for the party of your choice. For that 50% of the Cape Metro Council. And we also vote for the person in our area, whether we're from Newlands or Mulberry or Rondebosch or whatnot, to represent our interests in the Metro Council. By contrast, if you're in a small town, it gets a little complicated. Because it's not only about your local council per se, it's also voting for people to sit in a district council. Right? And the immediate thing about the system is that it therefore costs a lot of money to campaign and field candidates for local elections. Right? Parties with the most money are able to get representation easier than parties that don't. Right? But we can maybe talk about that in our discussion session. The second thing that I want to get our head over is this whole notion of the party system, meaning what kind of party system does this country have and use? And most academics for the past couple of years have called our party system the sort of dominant party system. But I think that from since the second term of Mr. Zuma, we've seen our system becoming a lot more competitive, which I think raises other possibilities about how it's more likely to move, right? But before I get into that, it's important to just explain how I think about party systems. A party system basically refers to a range of parties in any given system. And it's characterized by a few things, such as, firstly, the number of relevant parties. I'll explain what I mean by relevance, in the sense that it's why, for instance, we don't examine other parties and we do others. Secondly, the ideological nature of these parties. And thirdly, how these parties interact and compete with each other. So typically in a one-party system, one party is relevant and holds complete hegemony over its ideas and issues and policies and doesn't allow competition. Whereas by contrast, a competitive multi-party system will tend to have more than one relevant party and with a range of different ideas within that. In how we look at our country, right, usually we look at two main variables as a lens in analyzing South African politics. And the first one is we look at the extent to which parties penetrate society. That's very important for us. And the second, we look at the number of parties in the system. I'll be brief with this. On the first point, a number of issues are very important, right? When we look at parties' relations with society, we're really looking at the ties between voters and parties that are crucial in predicting, right? Such as, firstly, to what extent do voters identify with a party? One of the patterns that we have in our system, for instance, is that it doesn't matter how much of a disaster a mayor will be, they'll vote the guy back in again and again. And this has to do with the extent to which voters identify with that party. And we miss that sometimes, right? And as we'll see now, is that it won't be that ANC voters are not unhappy with Zuma. They're very unhappy with him, but they identify with the party in ways in which sometimes we don't see. And it's important for us to have that empathy in how we analyze politics. The second is party membership. Some parties are in parliament with no consistent membership base, which affects how they relate to society, which creates a whole lot of problems in how or in their role in politics. But it's why it is that there are few parties that are relevant and many that are not relevant. And the third and the fourth are the relationship between parties and the broader society with regard, number one, to civil society like trade unions or NGOs, and the general relevance that parties have to the lives of their citizens. And the second thing we look at is this notion of the number of parties. And this, I think, is perhaps my most important variable in trying to look at which, which parties to predict and look at. And when we classify party systems, we only classify only relevant parties. How do we define this? Firstly, we look at what is called its government or coalition potential. Right? And what that basically means is that at least that party, sometimes at least, it must be needed either on its own or with others to form a government. If it's not, it's irrelevant. We don't consider it. And the second is its blackmail potential. Right? I know it sounds bad, but not in our field. And what that basically means is that that party's existence has to affect the behavior of and competition between parties under A. That's why the EFF is so important. Not because of its numbers and its seats in parliament, but because it affects the behavior of other parties. Right? And so it's included in our basket of parties. And so therefore, to conclude this conceptual discussion, we argue that we have what is called a competitive dominant party system, which means that it is a dominant party system in the sense that one party has won elections consistently since '94, right? And the ANC qualifies as that. However, it's dominant with qualifications because we are beginning to see competition in our system. But obviously the big question is whether it can be translated into a change in voting behavior at the polls. But certainly, since about 2006, the DA, on the one hand, has gained government and coalition potential through controlling the Cape Metro and controlling the Western Cape provincial government. And on the other hand, the EFF, even though it's still quite soon, but I think that events of the last 2 years have shown us that the EFF has got black male potential, in the sense that its behavior or its actions have affected how the ANC behaves in Parliament. Whereas before, they wouldn't give a hoot on what you think. But things have shifted, right? Which means that going into this election, we are in or we could potentially be in a gray area. Obviously, if all things remain equal, where we might transition from a dominant party to a competitive multi-party system. But this we can interrogate in depth later. Now, what have the main trends been since 2000? I think that when we look at trends, what has interested me the most has not been, firstly, so much, which party has gained what at what point, or who has become the president and whatnot, but it has been this whole issue of voter registration and turnout. But this is my bugbear in this last year, and I pay attention not to what majorities the ruling party gets, or what crumbs the DA may get at one point in time, but really who is on the voters' roll and who is showing up in elections. And I think that in the past, we tend to ignore this because we assume that the voting market is saturated. And I argue that it's not, right? If we look at voter registration, I think that the one thing that comes up, and this is just IEC figures, is that the amount of voters on the roll has increased substantially in the last 15 years or so. More people are signing up for the roll, firstly. But also, secondly, there's also an increase in the population of people of voting age, which is significant. Right? If we look at the main metros, which are our main population centers, equally we also are seeing an increase in the rate of voter turnout in local elections. From, on average, about, say, 45%, an increase of about 10%. But what strikes me the most here is not so much the increase in people who are signing up, but people who are not showing up but have signed up. Johannesburg, over 1 million people in 2011 just didn't show up. Right. Forget about people of voting age, mind you. People who have made a choice to say, I will vote, and you don't show up. And in every major population area, this is a recurring pattern. And my question always is, who are these people? Yeah? Is it the old, young, working or not, and whatnot? Clearly they qualify to vote, but they're not there. If we look at general elections, I argue that this is not necessarily a pattern of people who are either just, or who might exhibit predictive behavior, but I think that it's actually a swing vote. Right? And this election, for me, says so. If we take the 2009 General election, for instance, there were about 23 million people on the roll. 17.5 million, just over, cast their vote. Now, those who voted for the majority party were 11.6 million. That is, half the people, or majority party, only got half the people on the roll. Right? Which for me is interesting. It means that people are choosing not to go and vote. I mean, obviously, we're going to predict here, right? I mean, we'll see what happens at the end of May this year, whether or not this is true. But I propose that the problem here is that many people would rather not go and vote than make a different electoral choice. Because what is on offer is just, they don't feel it. Right? If we look at the 2014 election, last year we have the same pattern. Once again, an increase in the amount of people on the books, meaning more people sign up. But look at the result. Majority party has less than half. Right? And I think that this means that, potentially the success of any party is dependent on the extent that it can tap into these missing people who clearly are making a choice to get on the books, right? But don't show up in an election. And from this perspective, I think that there will be some important battlefields coming into this next election. And I predict Johannesburg, Tshwane, and Nelson Mandela Bay are going to be the important battle areas going into the 2016 election for a few reasons. Right? If we begin with Johannesburg, in the 2011 local election, the ANC managed about 59.3%. And the DA, which was at that point the second largest party, got about 34.4%. And the EFF obviously didn't exist at this time. And this would suggest an important gap between the two. But if we are to put this result with the 2014 result, okay, I know it's a bad idea sometimes to combine local and national elections, but for argument's sake, let's do it and see what comes out. The picture looks a bit different. 2014, which has a higher voter turnout than a local election, majority party gets 52.3%. Right? Despite the fact that there was an increase in votes, there was a higher turnout overall in this election. But the higher turnout led more people to vote for a new party, EFF, 10% of Johannesburg. And what this may seem, therefore, is that the EFF made the biggest impact on the ANC's share in this election. And we all know what happened. Why? The EFF is a breakaway of the ANC Youth League, which otherwise was its core energy in electoral politics. But for me, what's more interesting is this whole notion of turnout, in the sense that the huge difference in turnout between 2011, where turnout was 54%, and 2014, where it was 72%. And once again, it sort of talks to this swing vote that is there, but perhaps makes different electoral choices in different elections. In a local one, you probably think, who votes for locals anyway? But in a national one, highly charged EFF people show up in an election and make a different choice. Tshwane, other example, same pattern, right? 2011, ANC manages, 56%, DA, 38%. But once again, if we look at 2014, ANC secures 49% in Tshwane. Right? Once again, higher 72% turnout in Tshwane in 2014. And 55% turnout in 2011. Right? And the final one, I think, which will be the mother of all battles, is Port Elizabeth. Right? And this is one where in the last 5 or so years, opposition parties in general have fared better. And the importance of this is that this is the core base of the majority party. Right? 2011, ANC secures 52%. 2014, 48%. Once again, higher turnout in 2014 affects the result than a lower turnout. So to conclude, and to allow some discussion, this is where I put my head on the block. What do I predict? Right. The first one, turnout of ANC voters. Traditionally, or in the last, 20 years or so, ANC wins not because of a majority of the electorate. That's not the reason why it wins. It wins because they get their people out to vote on the day. And that they can do. Other parties lose not because they can't get the people out, but because they can't convince those who don't want to vote to vote. So you have a large group of people who simply are on the books, but are either disillusioned or think they couldn't be bothered to vote. Right? Which means that ANC wins because they get the people out all the time on their day. And so the result will firstly be dependent on the turnout of ANC voters. If we see similar patterns to 2014, then we expect, depending obviously on how the other parties turn up, the ANC's vote to vary and to be dependent on the turnout of DA and EFF voters. For the DA, I think that the one thing that they can do is get the people out to vote on the day, but they can't convince others who are not DA to vote for the DA. And so their issue is more about the extent to which the EFF or the ANC will mobilize voters on the day. And for the EFF, they have a problematic constituency. Young people don't like to go and vote on a public holiday. They would rather be doing something else. Which means that they can have a massive rally with 55,000 people. 10% of those will vote. The others will be at a braai, watching football, playing PlayStation, etc. Right? This will be their test. Can you get 21-year-olds out on a queue on a public holiday? And the third prediction is the dark horse, the EFF. And in conclusion, I think that this is going to be the game changer. Because I do think that they will get their voters out on the day. Their formula for youth politics has worked and has affected the behavior of the majority party. Shall we discuss? Questions? Yes.
Apart from the question of voter turnout, is it valid to compare elections in 2011 when the EFF didn't exist with 2014?
It's valid insofar as identifying patterns of turnout for the two major parties concerned. I think that, as I said to you before, like there always is going to be, a question mark around not so much the years. I wouldn't say the years. I would say the types of elections, because the stakes are lower in a local election, right? Which is what affects turnout, right? But I think that for me is that it's the comparison is more to identify patterns of turnout for different parties, knowing that the stakes are lower in a local election. I think that for me, where it's most useful as an indicator of people's perceptions about a party at that moment. And I think that what, in fact, not just the 2011 elections per se, but the by-elections, right, are also a very good measure. Because in the end, only two parties are competing in by-elections, which gives you a huge window in terms of who is able to get people out on a Wednesday when it's raining. It's ANC and the DA. And that for me, while a by-election obviously is not a general one, tells you, who the real relevant parties are when it comes to electoral politics. Sure, we might not be able to predict a figure or a range, but without a doubt, if we are to look at, relevance, blackmail potential, it could be a 2-horse or a 3-horse race. Sure, you may have independence, yeah, but in the end of the day, I think that for me, that's where it's useful. Yeah. Yes.
Sorry, I would suggest that the EFF will get very few councillors in, but they will get their majority of people in through the proportional.
Of course, definitely, and I think that where that how that will not work out for them, potentially, is that they're really therefore competing for 50% of council seats, whereas ANC and DA compete for 100%, which affect the result in the end. And that's why in the end one thing is that it depends if EFF can do that, can get young people out on a public holiday to vote, then potentially it's a 3-horse race. But I do agree with you in that they like most other parties, where you are competing is really where's that wonderful slide I had? You're competing for sorry, this is apologies all around. Competing for the PR votes. And that's why two parties dominate, basically. That's true. Yes?
Have you ever done some correlation between party selection and those who pay tax, income tax?
I haven't, but somebody else has, though. And I actually thought I'd putting that slide up for today, but I didn't. But I think that how they worked it out was different. It wasn't about paying income tax per se, but employment and earnings, which might give you some kind of indication. Yeah. And yes, I think that if you look at our three main parties, one would argue that the profile of a DA supporter, right, is a working person who owns property and who pays higher income tax, right? I think that would come out. I think that your profile of an ANC person would range from a person who looks like a DA supporter to one who looks the complete opposite of one, right? And I think that, if you look at your sort of EFF supporter, it's definitely a young, urban person. Not really unemployed, though, interesting enough, because EFF's roots are at Wits University. But one that definitely will try to capture that market within electoral politics. And that would be, obviously not completely accurate, but roughly the idea of the different parties. I think they were, okay, can I just go this way? So I'll start with you and I'll move this way. Yes?
How much does parties spend influence the vote? The DA spend 150 million on election. The ANC spend about 500 million.
Something like that. Yep.
So how much
But that's
of an
private funding. That's private funding, though. Private funding.
Yeah.
Yes. Roughly, I think your figures are quite right. I think that, my understanding, I wrote an article about this about a few years back, is that the ANC's figures are quite conservative in that it could be more than that. And I think that for the ANC, being a party in government pays off in many different ways, which I think is what makes it, or the playing field is in its favor, even before the election has begun, definitely. And that the problem that we have is that we don't have laws that are able to regulate the private funding of parties. And both the DA and the ANC, in fact, one thing that they do agree on is they don't want to disclose who funds them. They'll agree on everything else, but they were like, you can't look at our funders, which is very interesting. They look the same in a way. Yeah, I'm moving this way, sorry. Yes? Maybe there's a mic here for you. No.
Could you ever predict or imagine to predict a coalition between the DA and the ANC and the EFF?
The question was, could I ever imagine to predict a coalition between the ANC, the DA and the EFF? Answer is, they will never be in coalition. And the reason why is because the EFF essentially is a breakaway ANC party. That's what it is. It's like COPE, but with a difference, right? So COPE was an old guard break, where people who are unhappy with, the Mbeki Zuma issue, and thought that Zuma was, all these bad words, and that they were not willing to in any way engage with him, which had a flip side to it, though, in that they never had a strong enough organizational base to break a way into. Whereas the EFF is the old ANC Youth League in terms of its leaders, its infrastructure, its people, and so forth, which meant that when they broke away, literally, the ANC Youth League split with all its infrastructure, which is why they are able to hold it together in ways that COPE cannot. But it doesn't mean that the EFF will never consider going back to the ANC, especially since their biggest weakness is that I don't think that they can think of the world after Malema. Because if he goes, then what? Who is next? And that's their big issue. And so for me, any logical coalition anyway, and by anyway I mean, your sort of coalition-prone Western Cape areas to a potential Johannesburg coalition to Tshwane, Port Elizabeth, will look increasingly more like the ANC approaching the EFF, but it will be that anti-Zuma ANC approaching the EFF, which will affect succession in the ANC, if that makes sense. I think that's the configuration, as opposed to the EFF looking elsewhere where they don't know. I don't see that happening. I'm moving to the gentleman there, and I'll come back to you afterwards. Yes.
How do you see the race issue playing out here? In the past, the DA has the face of Helen Zille. That has changed now. The DA has got a very bright young man out there. And also, you hear now the ANC making allegations of racism against the DA, and the DA leader has now said,
Yes.
if you want to be a member of the DA, you must swear an oath against racism. So how is that going to play out in the next election?
I think I can answer you in a few ways. Do you want my opinion? Okay, I'll give you what I think. A few points in that. The first one is that the parachuting Maimane to the position of leadership, in my view, is a tactical error on the part of the DA, and it's going to hurt them badly, I think. That's the first thing. And the reason being is that if you look at a person's background and profile, I don't think that he has sufficient experience inside his own organization to manage it and all its contradictions. The second point is the assumption that, firstly, that the big chunk of people who are not voting, or the swing vote, right, is going to be attracted to the DA simply because the guy at the top's a black guy. I don't think so. I don't think so. ANC has got Zuma, and trust me, they don't like him at all. So that will go the other way. I don't know. The third thing is assuming that you will compete for the ANC's market, its share, which is what Maimane's tactics are, right? You try to get ANC voters through various things, right? You know, going for saying you pro all these things, BE, NDP, and so forth, which is assuming that, you know, that why vote for this person who is saying the same thing as your own party? Makes sense. And his error, I think, is that they are not tapping into that swing vote that I think is very important, that doesn't really buy into a lot of what the majority party says. And so for me, I think that the way that the race will play out within this is that the ANC's tactics for the DA, I think, are always on autopilot, and they don't need to do more than they're doing, which is just say, this guy was parachuted because he's black. All these things. And for me, I haven't seen any evidence that people vote for the DA otherwise. In fact, my evidence says that the people who vote for the DA are its traditional voters, and that the variation in overall DA support has to do with turnout of ANC voters, meaning ANC voters not turning up affects this other group, its share, as opposed to the other way, and that includes Port Elizabeth. And so, in fact, I would flip the whole thing together. I would have said that, if I was a DA advisor, which I'm not, I would have gone for that gentleman. What's his name now? Trollope. Easy. But obviously, the way that the DA plays it, though, right, is that you play it in a way to assume that voters will simply look at how this person looks like, and he'll be the answer to all your prayers and whatnot, which I think is a big error. Whether or not it's going to cost me at the polls, I think, depends on the variables that are put out, turnout. Meaning, if all the DA can do is simply get their people to vote on the day, right? And if President Zuma opens up his mouth 4 times, trust me, they're going to get it. Sorry. Yes, sorry.
Do you think the fact that independent newspapers now support the ANC would have any effect on the outcome?
I think that. It was. Do I think that the influence that independent newspapers has over the ANC can affect the outcome? Am I correct? Yeah. For me, South African voters are very conservative, and by that I mean that they tend to stick with what they know, and they're very much like certain American voters, meaning they will vote for their party all the time. If they are not happy, they would rather not vote than change their preferences. And so for me, I think that the only, obviously we can't look too much into 10 years, but the only things that are going to change people's perceptions of their own parties is when people in their own parties fight over whatever it may be, and break away and split and so forth. Obviously, this is 20 years in, things can change. But I don't think that people read election manifestos. And I think that, when people listen to bad news of their party leader, it doesn't change their voting behavior. It makes them not vote, but not change it. And that for me is the sort of big issue. Very conservative voters, including young people, I think, they will say, "Well, my parents are this, and so therefore, blah blah blah." But yeah, so.
The COSATU splits within the ANC. The COSATU, would you say the COSATU people are likely not to vote?
Exactly. So if you look at NUMSA, right, even though NUMSA's core leaders chose to break away, your ordinary rank and file NUMSA person will have mixed feelings about making a different voting choice. Your leaders might go away, that's fine, right? But NUMSA rank and file people would perhaps rather not go and vote at all than choose a different election. And I mean, it's not to say that these things are set in stone, but I think that that missing 8 million, I think that doesn't show up. I think are people who could potentially make different choices, but simply choose not to. They would rather not go and vote. And so in many ways, we are also in a crisis of opposition, because opposition parties, are not able to resonate or to, capture what people actually want. Yes.
In view of the complicated nature of these local elections and what we've just seen in the recent past,
yes.
Could you say something about the capacity of the IEC to ensure orderly and free and fair elections?
I think as in general, the IEC, and in general I mean, last 20-something years, has done a good job, except for recently. And I think that, a few things have happened, I think. And the first one is that you've had changes in leadership in the IEC. And I don't know whether you guys are aware about how IEC people are appointed. Basically, you're appointed through Parliament, right? So, and I think that, the kind of parliamentarian we had 15 years ago is very different from the kind that we have now. There's been a regular turnover in Parliament in the last 10 years, where most MPs don't have the kind of institutional memory that is required, I think, for an MP who can serve a very good innings. And what that means is that they rely more on what your party tells you, as opposed to your judgment as a parliamentarian. And so therefore politics in many ways becomes dependent on people who sit elsewhere, who give instructions on how do you vote. And the IEC issue has been like that in the last, I would say, about 3 years or so, where you've had a regular changeover in people, and as a result, I think they've managed certain things quite badly. How it will affect this election, I'm not sure. But I think that if there was to be a turning point, it would be in people's perception of the IEC as not being fair. And once that happens, there are problems. There's very big problems beyond me. That is, yeah, you, and at the back, so you, and then you. Sorry, yes.
I think my question is,
yes.
You spoke about the untapped voters,
yeah,
who choose not to vote. Well, specifically with like the opposition party, is it because of the party's perception, or is it the party's policies? And sometimes the perception and the policies go together, because if the perception is it protects only the interests of a certain kind of people in South Africa. So is that why people would rather not vote at all? So what would, let's say, the DA have to do to maybe or is it their campaigning strategy? What would you say they need to do to tap into, or try and tap into that market?
I think maybe to answer it in a sort of roundabout way, I think that it's like trying to convince a hardened Republican voter in the US to vote for Democrats. Which means that on paper, if you look at ANC and DA policies, but I read manifestos. For me, there's very little difference. Sure, there's a tweak here and there, but very little difference. They're saying the same thing, right? Then you can say, well, then in terms of, governance, meaning how do they run their affairs when they are in office? I mean, I could be wrong, but I think that I would assume that there'd be very little difference. They both want to stay in power. Their primary preference is power. And through power, you do X, Y, Z. So for me, I think that the ANC and the DA, maybe at some point were at a distance, right? But my reading is that they've moved a lot closer to the center, where they are competing for the same ideological and policy space, but they present themselves differently, right? Which means, therefore, that the most important thing, therefore, is not so much what they say they can offer people, but more how people perceive them, which is shaped by a host of different things, right? It's shaped by you pointing what you read, right? It's shaped by your slogans, right? Whether or not they make any sense to you. It's shaped by your pure marketing. How do you sell yourself? And because I'm saying because for me the things I don't think people really get into the nitty-gritty of policy. People just don't have time, and so you read a one-liner here, one-liner there, and then you move on. And for me the most important thing is really if one was an advisor for whoever it may be, it would be how do you shape people's perception of you. Right, and that could mean different things. For instance, how do you present issues? What do you think is the most important thing to debate publicly? Because maybe most ANC people don't care about Nkandla per se, Maybe they don't. Maybe they think that we know that this bloke is like this. Anyway, but maybe their issues are there, and yet publicly you're there. Do you know what I mean? And so for me, that's how I read it. But obviously, I think that, the debate seems to be one that says people's understanding of your policy is what's going to get you their vote. And I think that people perhaps are not thinking further than what they see. Do you know what I mean? They don't engage with it as deep as we think that they do. Yeah, I think at the back they should.
Thank you very much. I just wondered, you didn't mention the UDM in connection with the Nelson Mandela Bay. Now, nationally, it's not a big deal, but it seems to be doing quite well in Nelson Mandela Bay Metro. And I wondered if you've made any assessment of what influence they might have on the ultimate results in that. Just on the issue of the face of the party and
yes.
critical of Municipal as the DA leader, he seems to be joined by some quite prominent and older and well-known and successful black people like Mashaba in Johannesburg and the councillor, the mayoral candidate in Victoria, who's apparently very well thought of. I wondered if you can comment on that.
Okay. On the UDM, I think for me, I think potentially the UDM could lose votes. I think, and where they could potentially influence a result either way is if you have a hung council, very similar like what you had in Cape Town. In fact, I think it was in 2006, where all of a sudden you could have 4 or 5 parties that were in the woodwork for many years, just creeping out. There were 7, yeah, and so for me, how I would think of their role to together with COPE as well, would be under those conditions. But even then, though, I'm still not sold on the EFF not wanting to go back in the ANC. I think they might go back, or if not, from some kind of coalition. I'm just not buying it. Yeah, I'm not buying it. And so for me, I think that in the event of a hung parliament in Port Elizabeth, you might see an EFF-ANC coalition. Because for me, what happened in Cape Town 10 years ago was specific to Cape Town. Where you had two big gorillas, ANC and DA, but you didn't have an EFF COPE type party. You had UDM, was it ID? They were still there around those days. You had, there was a FF. There were all the different people. Whereas I think that in PE, if you've got EFF in PE, which would be closer to ANC in PE, it's a very different kettle of fish, I think. Yes, on Maimane and Mashaba and whatnot. I'm still not really convinced of this idea that you parachute some person because he's black and all of a sudden he'll just attract votes. I don't think so at all, and there are big question marks about it. I think that for me, I don't think that even though the DA may have or may sort of present a very suave team, they have Maimane, who is GQ bloke, Hugo Boss suits, and you got Mashaba and this businessman. It all looks nice and glossy and pretty, right? I'm still not sure how that will resonate, though, with voters. Look, as I said, I could eat my hat and be like, okay, I was wrong, but I don't see it, and I think that I would have, if I was the advisor, gone for a person who has moved up those ranks, firstly, right, and who can manage a lot of the contradictions inside the DA, which I think these guys can't. Not because they're not able, but their lifespan inside the party is a little short. And that's my thing. Okay. Oh, can I answer you after this? Hands have been up a long time. Yes.
The fees must fall.
Yes.
How important do you think they will be in this election, and who will they vote for?
Oh, they're here. No, I didn't say it was you. No. Sorry. The one thing that has surprised me about the fees must fall movement is apart from that one episode in Joburg, I think, where one of the leaders joined the ANC. Am I right? I don't want to get shot down, no? Right? True. ANC member. Most of them have tried to, distance themselves from politics, which I think, suggests this big missing this swing vote I'm talking about, in that, they're not really happy with what they see. And so, in terms of, how they've acted since then, is that they've tended to be those types who just won't go and vote, I think.
Thank you.
Are we beyond time? I don't know. I don't want to be angry with people. Oh, sorry. Okay.